Hi, I'm Tony Goddard. This is My New York, and boy, am I glad to have you back for part 2 of my chat with Juliet Papa. She is irrepressible, she's delightful, and we're going to hear more of her stories next. So, last week you were telling the story about, you're in this restaurant and the mob guys send over the bottle of wine and you don't know how to handle that situation, right. And you handled it beautifully. And it reminded me of a time I'm in a restaurant on East 58th Street, Italian restaurant, with the lady I was dating at the time and her parents from out of town. And we had theater tickets. And so I pay the bill, and it's like 7:30, and we're leaving this restaurant to get to the theater. And a guy at the door stops me and says, "Mr. Agnello Della Croce would like to talk to you." And I said, "Oh, really? That's the mob guy from the village. It's like the boss." And I see him sitting, beautiful white hair and a tan. I said, well, to his man, I said, "Gee, well, that's really nice. Would you tell him I appreciate it? And some other time I got to get to the theater." And he says, "No, Mr. Della Croce would like to talk to you." So my girlfriend and her parents are going out in the street wondering, and I'm going back in. And I walk over to the table, and he gets up and he shakes my hand, and he wants to introduce me to his whole table. It's like 7 guys with their gumad. This is like a Thursday, this Friday night or whatever. It's gumad night. They're all the girlfriends.
Wow.
And this is Jimmy, and this is Frankie, and this is Sally, and this is Christine, and I'm going, oh, wonderful. And I love that there's an Italian boy on television. You do our race proud. And I'm going, what am I gonna do?
Well, you were a star to them. That's why, because they saw you on TV.
So I finally say, "Mr. Della Croce, it's delightful. Perhaps we could talk again. I have to get to the theater." "Oh, sure, go have a good time. Have a great night." And we get outside, and now we're going to be late for the theater. And the parents from out of town going, "What was that all about?" I said, "Well, there was a man you don't want to know. I can't explain this to you." And we missed part of the first act.
Yeah, you're right. But you had to go and say hello.
Well, I thought so.
Yeah.
Yes.
That was a good idea.
I was a little worried that maybe I should not offend the man.
Correct. Good move.
Yeah. So other characters, you've covered them all. I mean, you've covered them all. And I was thinking about, there's a lot of talk around taxes today. Are they going to go up? And what's Biden going to do? And I remember the woman who was known as the Queen of Mean.
Oh, Leona.
Leona Helmsley.
Leona Helmsley. She was fascinating in her own way, correct? There were headlines about her all the time, and then she had a horrible reputation of being so awful to her employees. But she was powerful and rich, and she had the hotels, and she loved her husband. So she went to trial for, tax evasion. And I covered that whole trial. And then she subsequently went to trial after that in a civil case where a former manager of one of her properties was suing her because he said he was unfairly fired. But her defense was that he was trashing. He and his friends, he would invite his friends to party, and they were trashing the place. And she got rid of him because he wasn't being responsible and he wasn't being a good manager. So it's so interesting. So big show trial was the federal case, the tax case, and she gets convicted and she goes to prison. Personally, I happen to think she was like sedated through most of this trial because she never spoke to the press. And she was always accompanied by somebody, and she always just looked out of it. But there was this one instance. Now, here's somebody who's very wealthy. She always dressed beautifully, her classic designer clothes. So there was, they'd always have these breaks in the trial. And I remember there was a bathroom that you'd have to go out of the courtroom and go down a few steps because it was sort of on the landing between the floors. And there's only like 2 stalls in there, so you really didn't have a lot of time for a 15-minute break. You'd run down there, you take care of what you had to take care of, and you come back up. So I run down there, and who's in one of the stalls? I see her Ferragamo shoes is Leona Helmsley, right? And I had this like epiphany moment, and I said, she pees like everybody else.
You said that to
To
yourself
myself.
or out loud?
Yeah, no, to myself, because there she was, doing what everybody else does the same way.
Exactly,
It didn't
of course.
matter her money. It didn't matter her wealth, her fame, her shoes. She does this. It so grounded me from that point on about anybody else who thought they were rich, powerful, famous. Didn't matter.
Yeah.
Because that was like everybody's baseline. It's right there.
And I guess she never said to you, of course we would have been hearing it forever as a soundbite, this, what did she say, we don't pay, me and my husband,
Yeah.
we don't pay taxes.
Only the little people pay taxes.
Yes.
That was it, yes. But, she would never say. But I'll never forget some of the testimony was, she never paid the contractors the last payment of the contract. And that she was notorious for doing this. She would stiff
stiffing
people.
everybody.
Well, one of her, one of the people, it was like a personal assistant handler, and the guy was a lot of fun, and he was really a great guy. He said, I'll tell you why, because when she was doing these repairs at Dunellen Hall, which was her estate in Connecticut, they would like just triple the price on everything. So like a screw in the wall would cost $1,000. So she knew this, and she knew she's getting overcharged for everything in sight, and so she would just stiff them at the end. So that was her way of sort of getting even and evening the playing field. She says because she knew that they would charge her every which way but Sunday. So then she had the civil trial, and that was a lot less publicity after that. So there were only a couple of reporters covering that. And she was approachable because we could sit in the hallway, during a break. And she was sort of chatty. I think she was curious about who you were and what you did and how you did it and why you were covering this. And I'll never forget, she had this beautiful pearl ring on her finger. It was gigantic, but it was really nice looking. And I remarked about it, and I said, that's really a very pretty ring. And she says, oh yeah, Cindy Adams thought the same thing. Cindy Adams
Sure.
is a gossip columnist for the New York Post. And she says, yeah, well, Cindy Adams and I were having lunch once, and she actually had the nerve to say to me, I want that. And she just like asked for the ring. And she sort of was like outraged that somebody would just have the nerve to just go ask her for that piece of jewelry. And she said, no, well, that wasn't going to happen. But it was just so interesting to hear her on a very human level,
Must be hundreds of other fascinating characters you came across that we know about because of, the news. Who?
I will say Ben Brafman, he very early on represented Sammy Gravano. And then initially he represented Harvey Weinstein, and that was most recent. And then he did some other major cases. But excellent attorney, defense attorney. Like if ever I got into big trouble, that's the first person I would call.
Yeah. Ben is remarkable.
But he was always very good and very smart, and I felt he was very helpful to me, in many ways, either explaining something to me.
Points of law, or
yeah.
his strategy,
And in a
maybe
really
off the
good way.
record.
Yeah, just really helpful. And he did Puffy Combs. Remember that trial, Puffy Combs? And that was, Johnny Cochran. You talk about characters.
Wow. Yeah.
He would wear, and we would laugh, because Puffy Combs was on trial they shot somebody up in a club, right? And he was acquitted, and his co-defendant was not. But he would show up, now he was from California, And, you know, the
Co-
defense,
Cochran, yeah.
So the New York lawyers are coming in, they're very conservative, you know, navy blue suits or pinstripe suits. He would wear this pea green suit with this like pink and orange tie. And I would say to him, like, wow. And he says, well, yeah, this is the way I roll. You know, he didn't care because he was Johnny Cochran. And he just came with these bright, flamboyant suit. But, you know, he made his mark that way. He really was, and he was charming and very affable and, you know, knew what to do in the courtroom. And sort of, you know, worked the room with the reporters. Like, it just was fascinating sort of watching him in action. He was great.
You know, we cover the news, or at least I used to. Sometimes the news can become personal, and for you it was Superstorm Sandy, right?
Yeah, Superstorm Sandy was something else. Superstorm Sandy was knocking everything off and destroying homes, and there was this huge high-rise in Midtown Manhattan called 157, and it was almost completed. It's, you know, 75-story building. It happened to be right behind the building that I live in, which is a, you know, 9-story pre-war building. So here we are, you know, 157, Juliet's building.
Right.
And there was a crane on top 157. And the crane started falling off. So I'm home. I knew I had to work at 5 a.m. the next morning. I had to be in the studio anchoring our Superstorm Sandy coverage, okay? Which means I had to get up at 3 in the morning and, you know, get into the studio by, you know, 4 to start to work. So that evening, and this is about 5 o'clock, I'm getting a knock on the door, and these firefighters are telling us we have to evacuate because the crane is,
Evacuate your building.
yeah, the whole building had to evacuate because the crane might fall over and it could land on our building. And I'm like, oh, okay. So they're knocking on everybody's door, and I don't know why, like, I didn't like rush the hell out of there because I'm thinking, I have to go to work tomorrow. Where am I going? I have to get a hotel room, right? My neighbors, they're like, nah, we're gonna finish dinner. So they were running out the door. I said, well, I gotta figure something out. So I packed a bag, and I'm going out, and I see, it was like the Wizard of Oz. There were, you know, the street lights, the traffic lights swinging in the breeze. There were stop signs that came out of the ground, out of the sidewalk. They were flying around the air. There were branches from trees, just like things were flying.
You didn't need to go to the studio. You could have reported right from
They're
your...
right there.
Right
But I
home.
said, well, I don't want the crane on my head. So I go over on Lexington Avenue. I get a hotel room, and I don't even know, did I fall asleep? I have no idea. I go to work from there. I said to the hotel, oh, hi, listen, I might need to be here another night. You have a room. Oh, yeah, no problem. We have a bunch of people checking out tomorrow. Okay, great. So I finish my shift. I call the hotel. They're all booked. There's no room at the inn. So now I have no place to go. A friend of mine happened to call me because she knew where I lived and this crane is hanging. And I said to her, yeah, I don't have a place to stay right now. I don't know, I got to start looking around. She goes, oh, friends of mine were at the Hotel Lucerne and they just checked out. So call them up. Now that's the one now that had the homeless problem.
Yes.
Like recently.
On the west side,
Yeah,
the west side.
off Amsterdam. Beautiful boutique hotel. I booked 3 nights because I said, somebody's paying for this because, and I'm thinking, well, we're gonna go back. I was out of my apartment for 8 days, stayed in 3 different hotels, and still went to work every morning at 5 a.m. to report on the story.
And you're watching the wires for news of whether that crane fell
It was
on your
gonna
building.
fall over, right? It was just unbelievable. But this is, you know, living in New York.
Let's talk about City Hall. You spent a lot of time there. I spent a lot of time there. One of the people we covered who had a job there was called Ed Koch.
Oh yeah.
I found him, I mean, like every New Yorker, well, many New Yorkers, fascinating, interesting, bedeviling, and finally just irritating. Just too much of the how am I doing, how am I doing, how am I doing. If you had to hear that every day, what was your time covered?
Wow, I was very young. He was like the first mayor I covered. So I was sort of fascinated, enthralled, and I was a nervous wreck because I'm this like sort of young kid reporter, and there was like there's Gabe Pressman, asking the mayor questions, right? So I finally got the nerve, I think, at some point to ask him a question. Oh, Mr. Mayor, blah, blah, blah. He goes, well, you asked that question so nicely, he says, but, blah, 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 whatever he said. And I'll never forget Gabe Pressman turned to me and he said, that was a very good question. And I was so proud of myself.
That's the blessing from Olympus. From
like,
Gabe?
Yay! So after that, I had no fear. After that, I had no fear. That was it.
You remember
really
the
something.
Parking Violations Bureau scandal?
Oh, yes.
And at that time, Donald Maness was the borough president of Queens, and he was also the Democratic leader of Queens.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, Donald Maness is in the hospital.
Yes.
We don't know, mysteriously.
Yes, and they sent me over there, and we're standing outside at the time. It was Booth Memorial Hospital. He was trying to kill himself, and I was reporting from out there. That was horrible.
Yeah. Well, we didn't know in the first instance why that he had tried to kill himself.
Yes.
And this scandal hadn't broken yet. Maness.
Yes, nobody knew like what was going on. That it was like, what was that related to?
Well,
or
I'll never forget, and you probably remember this too. Front page of the Daily News on a Sunday, Jimmy Breslin blows the story wide open.
Wow.
The whole Parking Violations Bureau scandal, the participation of Maness, and the guy in Stanley Friedman in the Bronx. And the previous week, at the news conferences that Koch would have every morning at City Hall at 11, the first thing he would do was report on my friend Donnie in the hospital. He's doing okay, my friend Donnie, and every morning. Comes Monday morning after the next week after the Daily News front page, and up on all of a sudden Ed Koch is saying, Mr. Maness.
Oh.
It's no more my friend.
Wow.
It was Mr. Maness, and he's very official. And I turned to Murray Kempton, and who was standing there with me, and I said, did you hear?
Like the difference?
He said, yeah, he's walking away.
Wow.
He doesn't want any part of it.
Very good.
And I told my station, I said, listen, we have tape of every day, in the file for the past week. There's a story, besides the big story of the Parking Violations Bureau scandal.
Right.
The sidebar can be Koch, the hypocrite. And we'll play those sound bites from Monday, Tuesday. My friend Donnie, he's doing better. My friend Donnie, he's feeling nice. My friend Donnie wants you to know. And then following Monday, Mr. Maness is,
right.
And they wouldn't do it.
Wow, that's a good story though.
They wouldn't do it.
He started changing his tune. Well, I will never forget, remember he was running for governor?
Oh, yeah.
Against Cuomo, Mario Cuomo.
Sure.
And we, at the time, I was working at the Long Island station, WGBB, and we had a gubernatorial debate there. And I was like one of the people on the panel. Mm-hmm. But it was funny because we were in this old building where the carpet was probably like rancid, and here comes Scotch walking into the building. And he was so confused because I was covering, news in the city, and I'm working out there, and he couldn't figure out what I was doing on the panel at WGBB. He said, he sees me at City Hall. But it was such a bad fit. Even then, he was in the burbs. We were in Merrick, Long Island, and he was in the burbs, and this just wasn't a place for him.
He hated the burbs.
Yeah.
I forgot what he said about upstate, that, he basically set fire to upstate in terms of any chance he would get a vote up there.
It wasn't going to work for him. Like, now de Blasio, is, thinking about, or, the speculation is he wants to run for
Tell
governor.
me about de Blasio. I've been observing from afar, but not terribly intently. Tell me, what is it with this guy? Is he as is he as narcissistic as he seems?
I think he believes his own. He talks to himself, I guess, and certainly believes. I think the Times headline was good the other day. Can de Blasio run for governor? He thinks so. I thought that was a perfect headline for him. That's why he ran for president. I really feel that he feels he has this specific progressive agenda. And this is what he wants to promote in whichever form he can. He did it as the mayor. And then he's going to try to take another public office to do that. He's a bit of a contrarian, He's, I think, a bit of a hippie. He's all about grassroots. He uses that phrase very, very often.
Like any politician, he's looking for the next job. They're in
needs a
this
job.
job, and then you go to the next job.
He needs a job.
You run for the next office. We started this conversation last week with you telling me you grew up in the Bronx near Yankee Stadium, and first thought maybe you'd one day be a major league center fielder, which I wish you had done.
I think that's coming, by the way. I would love to see a professional female baseball player in Major League Baseball in my lifetime. I would love to see that. I don't know. That would be fantastic.
Well,
they're making headway. They have a general manager now.
Sure.
The Marlins.
The Marlins have the
Right.
Kim Eng,
Yeah.
I guess her name is.
Yeah.
And she was a front office person for the Yankees. Now she's the general manager of
Right.
the Marlins. So you're probably right. It's on the way. But I wanted to maybe we can go out on your memory of being able to cover the Yankees and being among the first women in the locker room.
Oh, well, just to be there to cover so many playoff games and World Series is so exciting. First of all, you see it's a responsibility because you're covering the game and there's no cheering in the press box, right? You really have to control yourself because you're going as a fan. You cannot wear any Yankee gear, blah, blah. No, you can't. But for the most part, I would be doing fan coverage.
Yeah.
So it wasn't so much I'm doing play-by-play, although with Twitter, I was tweeting out every play and every observation
But
I had.
you got to interview Mattingly, right?
Oh,
in the locker room.
Locker room. So this was great. This was very early on when women were finally being allowed into the locker rooms, right? And so it had already been underway for a while. And just to digress, I'll give you a good locker room story. The New York Islanders. Mm-hmm. They were very early on letting women in because there were several hockey players, hockey reporters who were women. And Chico Resch was getting traded.
Goaltender.
Right, was getting traded. And I will never forget, we go to do the interview with him and he was really upset. I think they lost or whatever, and it was his last game on the one team. And he just stood there stark naked in front of his locker, and he just didn't care. Usually the guys cover themselves with a towel, or you have to wait until they're dressed. Yeah. No way.
But it wasn't exhibitionism. He was just...
No, that was what he was doing, and you were a reporter, that was it. But that was interesting because okay, just focus on his face because what are you gonna do, right? It was a little uncomfortable, but you did your job. So here's Don Mattingly now. I'm sent to go cover the story because the tabloids were making a big deal out of Mattingly not having in these terrible contract negotiations with George Steinbrenner. Okay, and George Steinbrenner was tough, and Don Mattingly was beloved, and how could they not be dealing with him fairly on his contract? And Don Mattingly wasn't the most, I'd say, cooperative with the press, kind of kept to himself, didn't really say too much. All right, so here I am now in the old Yankee Stadium in the locker room, and I'm sitting there, and I didn't really know the protocol in there because I'd never been in there before, right? So I'm just watching all these sports reporters lay back. I'm how come they're just not going up and talking to this guy, right? and I'm standing there and I'm looking at my watch and it's like, I got to get a story on. Like, I have to get this on the air. So this is like about 40 minutes. And I'm like, all right, this is it. Whatever happens, happens.
Yeah.
I walked right up to Don Mattingly. I just walked right up to him. Nobody else. I'm the one that goes, and I go. And his back is towards me because he's getting stuff in his locker. And I go, oh, excuse me, Mr. Mattingly. Now, most sports writers know these guys by their first names, but I never met this guy. What do I know? And he turns around, and I ask him in a very, I guess, polite way. I said, listen, I understand and I'm thinking he's going to like throw me right out of there and get the hell out of here, and I'm not talking about this. Well, he just starts chatting. Yes, well, it's been kind of a difficult process, and I'm like, okay, the microphone, and all of a sudden I felt this like whoosh
Of the other reporters.
It was like this wind. This movement just came around me. And he's going on. And he's being very calm and he's being very normal. And I got out of there with my interview and I called the station and I told my editor, I got Don Mattingly. And he's like, what?
Juliet Papa. I said you're the queen of New York radio news, and you are. It is delightful to talk
Thank
stories
you.
with you. We could keep doing this forever, but they want to close this joint. They're going to throw us out. Thank you. Thank
My
you for
pleasure.
this.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching, folks.